Hey everyone, welcome back to Sociable 2. Hope you had a great Easter break. I know it was a little strange this year, but hopefully we're going to be through this soon. But one thing I know for sure is that we will be done with this semester very soon. Today we are beginning our last section of the semester on contemporary theories of justice. And my task today is mainly to try to help you understand how we're getting from talking about gender and race to now talking about contemporary theories of justice, and also to think a little bit how the course as a whole fits together. You'll recall that we began this entire year reading everyone's favorite book, yes, Plato's Republic, and that Socrates is asking the question, what is justice? So now I think it's appropriate that we are ending the semester once again talking about contemporary theories of justice. We've been dealing really with some concrete issues: class inequality the first half of the semester, public works, how do we deal with working poor, and this half of the semester with gender and racial inequality. And now we're going to move into these theoretical approaches. So besides trying to tie these two different halves together, I'm also going to try to give you a framework for understanding these four different theories of justice and sort of where they fall on a spectrum, and so you can kind of think about where they are placed, how they might deal with these different particular issues as we move through the next couple weeks of the class. So how did we get here? How do we get from this issue of racial and gender inequality to these theories of justice? Well, we might think about more specifically, how does a section on race fit into this course? Right? Maybe think about that for a minute. Why do you think a class called Social World, especially the second half of this class, which is focused on sociology and the problem of order and modernity, why would we talk about race? Well, in particular, I think we want you to see that there's history and a continual practice of racial discrimination in America. With my small group, we really talked about how we want you to read the Coates article and to watch the video on race, the power of an illusion, because we want you to be able to tell the story that gets all the way from our nation's beginnings and the history of slavery to current day racial inequality in America, and that there really are particular concrete steps that have led along the way. Also, going back to the beginning of this semester, I talked a lot about babies, right, and how in-group loyalty, even with babies, trumps fairness. And I think we definitely see this in America today. People that are a part of the same in-group, are a part of the same community, people that look like you, that like the things that you like, that do the things that you do, you tend to value them more. And unfortunately, this continues to affect our public policy. So we need to look at contemporary theories of justice that might be able to combat this in-group loyalty that unfortunately often goes ahead of issues of fairness and justice. So in particular, you might think about over the last couple weeks what we've learned about how racial discrimination is perpetuated in contemporary America. Maybe write down a couple things real quick. Got something in mind? How has racial discrimination been perpetuated in contemporary America? I mean, right now, in the last 20 years, in your lifetime. Well, here's a couple things that we've talked about. A big one, of course, is that Michelle Alexander hits on is mass incarceration. This is incredibly discriminatory. The war on drugs, right? Something that seems to be innocuous and racially neutral, it turns out isn't at all. Wealth, right? This has been one of the things that we focused on the most in the last couple weeks. There is a huge wealth disparity, and the difference in wealth is largely rooted in the kind of house that you own, and even more than the kind of house you own, where that house is located. Right? In the video we watched, talk about the difference between income inequality and wealth inequality. Two families can make the same amount of money, can both have the same education. One family can live in one neighborhood, and the other family lives in a different neighborhood, and their wealth is far different because of these two different locations. Well, how does that work? I mean, how can that be the case? Well, I think you know at least part of the answer. let's look at an example. Coates talks a lot about Chicago in his article, and so I thought maybe looking at Chicago would be a good place to start. There are big differences in the kind of education that you receive based on where you live in the city of Chicago. So I talked to my small group. I think most of you know public education is funded by property taxes, but it's not funded by state property taxes. It's not even funded by necessarily citywide property taxes. It's funded by district property taxes. Waco ISD is funded by Waco property taxes. Midway ISD is funded by Hewitt Woodway property taxes. China Spring ISD is funded by, yes, you guessed it, China Spring property taxes. This can make a huge difference in the kind of education that you get. So in Winnetka, which is one of the wealthiest suburbs in America, it's a suburb of Chicago, the median value of a house is $1.2 million. In Chicago as a whole, the whole of Chicago, not just, say, certain inner city neighborhoods, the median value is $208,000. This, of course, is reflected in income. The median income in Winnetka is about $208,000 compared to about $48,000 in Chicago. So think about how big a difference that makes, how much you make, and then how much your house is worth. So what difference does this make for students? Well, Winnetka spends about $22,000 per pupil compared to Chicago's $15,000. What does that $7,000 a person, a student, get for you? Well, I mean, it gets all kinds of things, right? It gets better sports equipment, it gets better classrooms, laptops, computers, science equipment. It gets paid for AP lab credits and for test prep. I mean, there's just so many things. But just as one example, Winnetka's brand spanking new Trier High School has 10 librarians in one high school. Most Chicago high schools have 0 full-time librarians. And it shouldn't be surprising to you now, based on what you've read, that Winnetka has 11,300 white residents, just over 90%, and 17, yes, 17 black residents. And if you read Coe's article, and if you watched Race, the Power of an Illusion, The House We Live In, you now understand the story about public and social policies that have led to having cities like Winnetka. These differences between the kind of opportunities that are available to a student in Winnetka versus other places in Chicago point to the reality of social facts, right? In the way that social facts and forces limit the kinds of opportunities that individuals have. It really matters where you're born. It really matters what kind of house you live in. These kinds of forces that are outside of the individual's control largely limit the kinds of opportunities the person has. And I hear, of course, a lot of us might be thinking at this point, look, come on. We all make choices, right? No matter where you're born, we make choices. We make choices whether to work hard. We make choices whether to get up and go to school every day. We make choices about what we eat and what we wear. And we just, there's individual responsibility, right? Doesn't this have a lot to do with the kind of life that you live? And I think that that's a valid question. But to think about that question, I think it might help to focus on this distinction that the Harvard economist Kenneth Galbraith makes between two kinds of poverty, case poverty and insular poverty. Case poverty refers to, quote, some quality peculiar to the individual or family involved, mental deficiency, bad health, inability to adapt to the discipline of industrial life, uncontrollable procreation, alcohol, discrimination involving a very limited minority, some educational handicap unrelated to community shortcoming, or perhaps a combination of several of these handicaps, which has kept these individuals from participating in the general well-being. Right? And I think we can all think of examples of case poverty, right? For instance, my wife has an aunt, her dad's brother, and her aunt, 3 siblings. Her aunt's really just made a lot of bad choices in life. She's gone bankrupt several times. They just blow a lot of their money. They're constantly running up credit card bills way beyond what they can pay. They have enough money to live on, but they often quit their job. They end up bouncing around. They just have made a lot of bad choices, and they've just been kind of lazy. We know people maybe in your family or somebody else's family who really do just live off the government. They just take disability checks, and they just decide that that's the way they're going to live. There are people that are lazy or who suffer from handicaps or who suffer from alcoholism or drug abuse, and that can contribute to poverty. But that's not the only reason that people are in these kinds of situations. Galbraith helpfully points to a second kind of poverty, which he calls insular poverty, which manifests itself as an island of poverty. In the island, everyone or nearly everyone is poor. Here, evidently, it is not easy to explain matters by individual inadequacy. We may mark individuals down as intrinsically deficient in social performance. It is not proper or even wise so to characterize an entire community that way. The people of the island have been frustrated by some factor common to their environment. So let's think about that more in relation to what we've been reading the last couple weeks. Coates notes that North Lawndale, which is a city in Chicago, is now on the wrong end of virtually every socioeconomic indicator. The neighborhood is 92% black. Its homicide rate is 45 per 100,000, triple the rate of the city as a whole. The infant mortality rate is 14 per 1,000, more than twice the national average. 43% of the people in North Lawndale live below the poverty line, double Chicago's overall rate. 45% of all households are on food stamps, nearly 3 times the rate of the city at large. If you are born into North Lawndale, your opportunities are very different than if you're born into Winnetka. North Lawndale is an island of poverty and racial inequality that traces far back to public, social, economic policies. Oops, we skipped ahead 1 second. So this brings up what I think is a really interesting problem and something that we ought to think about, and something that theories of justice have to take into consideration. And it's what philosophers call the problem of moral luck. And if you know me, you won't be surprised that this problem goes back to Aristotle. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines moral luck as occurring when an agent can be correctly treated as an object of moral judgment, praise, or blame, despite the fact that a significant aspect of what she is assessed for depends on factors beyond her control. So oftentimes we might blame somebody for doing something, even though a significant reason why they did it was something that they couldn't really help. A more important way to think about that's talking about really moral responsibility in a pretty technical area. But there's a broader way that this can be discussed, and this is the way that it really goes back to Aristotle, and that's in this notion of eudaimonistic luck. Maybe some of you remember the word eudaimonism. Aristotle says we all want to be happy. We all want eudaimonia. We all want flourishing. We want happiness. So this notion of eudaimonistic luck is that the hand we are dealt with in life has a profound effect on our ability to live a happy, healthy, successful life. Where you're born, who your parents are, the kind of house that you have, the kind of school that you go to. These are all things that are completely outside of your control. Yet we know that these things play a huge role in the kind of person that you're going to become. We know that the amount of print media that you are exposed to by the time you're 5 years old, in other words, how much your parents and caregivers read to you by the time you're 5 years old, correlates very strongly with your SAT score. So if you grew up in a house where you had 2 parents and an opportunity to get read to all the time, or you went to a really good daycare, this makes a huge difference. Even before that, just your pre- and postnatal care makes a huge difference for the kind of outcomes we see in high school and college. You might also remember that Aristotle thought some things were different. Aristotle thought that what was required for happiness was different than Plato. Plato really thought that virtue alone made you happy. If you're a good person, that's it. If you're just, you're going to be happy. If you, at the end of your life, if you're strung out on the rack with a horrible reputation, but you were just, you'll still be happy. That's the challenge of the Republic and what Socrates is trying to prove. Aristotle disagrees. Aristotle thinks you need to be virtuous, to be a good person, to be a morally good person, but you also need some external goods. You also have to have a roof over your head, clothes on your body, food to eat. I mean, you can't just get by on goodness alone. Furthermore, he says, it's not unimportant how we are habituated from our early days or childhood. Indeed, it makes a huge difference, or rather all the difference. And here's actually a point right where Plato and Aristotle agreed. Your upbringing is largely determinative of the kind of person you're going to become. If you have a morally good upbringing, you're going to become a morally good person. If you don't, you're not. And again, we think of how this might extend broader to your life, the kind of just education that you bring, that you receive growing up. So here's the question then. For Aristotle, can anything prevent a virtuous person from being happy? I mean, I've kind of pointed to a little bit of what it might be. No external goods, perhaps. Let's watch this together and think about this question. That, of course, was Achilles talking to Priam. Priam has lost both of his sons. His city is burning around him. And Aristotle's question is, can Priam be happy? Even if he is a deeply, deeply virtuous person. So, quote from the Ethics, "For many reversals and all sorts of luck come about in the course of a life, and it is possible for the person who was most especially doing well to encounter great calamities in old age, as in the stories told about Priam in the Trojan War. But when a person has such much misfortunes and ends in a wretched condition, nobody says that he is living well." The point that I want to drive home here is that Coates, Galbraith, and Aristotle all agree that no person is self-made. Everybody needs a little bit of luck. The place that you were born, the parents that gave birth to you, the schools that you grew up in, yes, even the house that you lived in and the neighborhood that you grew up in, all these things contributed to the kind of person that you are now. You would not be who you are if it weren't for things that are completely outside of your control. Luck plays a huge role in all of our destinies. We are all, as McIntyre says, dependent rational animals. We are all dependent on all these other forces, these structures, these people. They make us who we are. They give us the opportunities that we've had. And if we are doing really well at this point of our lives, we have to be willing to point back to all those other forces that are outside of our control. So then there's a question. And this is the question I think we bring to these contemporary theories of justice. We still have profound gender and racial inequality in this country. We have profound moral and eudaimonistic luck. We have profound ways that social forces contribute to whether or not we're happy. What might we do about this? How might we really have a society that allows for freedom and justice for all, fairness for everybody? that gives everybody a fair shot. I think most of us want a society where we all get what we earn, where we are actually able to be rewarded for our merits. But in our current society, that's not how it works. You're not rewarded for your merit. You're rewarded largely for your luck. The kind of world, small world, that you were born into. All right, so we've got these 4 theories of justice, and I really think they take 2 main approaches to this problem of moral luck. What might we do? How might we deal with it? Well, on the one hand, we can minimize moral luck by increasing individual liberty. Right? If we want everyone to have a fair shot at the American dream, we can make moral luck no longer much of a factor if we make everybody as free and unencumbered as possible. Right? Everybody should be free to control their own destiny, to pursue the ideals that they want, and hey, if they want to just stay at home and live on disability, that's fine, but they ought to be able to have the opportunity to do well. So let's increase individual liberty and give them that opportunity. On the other hand, though, we might think we can minimize moral luck by creating better communities. If we think, as Plato and Aristotle did, that the kind of community that you're raised in is fundamental for the kind of person that you'll become, morally, intellectually, spiritually, all these sorts of things. If your community really makes a profound difference in the kind of person you'll become, maybe the way to minimize moral luck is actually to focus on creating virtuous and good communities. So these are 2 different approaches. I'm dividing them up into sort of the more liberal half and the more conservative half. Now, on the one hand, to say some are liberal and some are conservative is really misleading. These are all liberal theories in the sense that they are in our Western liberal political tradition. They are all focused on freedom and justice for all. All of these thinkers are free market capitalists. We're not reading a Marxist. We're not reading a socialist. They are all liberal in the classical sense of the word, which I'm going to cover in just a second. But I'm going to give you a way to think about how 2 of them are really liberal in this classical sense and 2 are more conservative. So let's look at that. Of course, liberal comes from the Latin liberalis, meaning noble, gracious, munificent, generous. Literally of freedom pertaining to or benefiting a free man from labor, free, unrestricted, unimpeded. So to be liberal is to really want freedom. Right? Individual freedom, freedom to pursue what you want, openness to go after and pursue your dreams. So really all 4 of these are liberal in that sense, but these first 2 are particularly liberal in the fact that they are focusing on individual freedom. Both of these liberal theories seek a society that maximizes individual freedom and thus minimizes the role of moral luck, but they go about it in very different ways. So our most liberal position, which might be a little ironic if you know much about libertarianism, our most liberal position is actually Nozick's libertarianism. It's most liberal in this etymological sense that I'm just explaining. For Nozick, the individual liberty is the dominant goal of social organization and seeks to maximize the autonomy of the person. The state has a minimal role. The state is really just for protection from external threats and internal threats. That's it. And the less the state interferes in individuals' lives, the more they will be in control of their own destiny, and this will minimize moral luck. Right? So if we get the state out of it, and we just have a situation where every individual is completely and utterly free to pursue their own notion of happiness, then you get what you deserve. That's the idea here. So the key to letting everybody get what they deserve and get what they want is to get the government out of it. Right? This is Ron Swanson's political theory. If you don't know who that is, you need to catch up on your Parks and Rec. The next most liberal theory is John Rawls' political liberalism. It's liberal in the same sense that we want freedom for the individual, but it goes about it in the completely opposite way. In order to grant every citizen freedom, we must level the playing field. Right? For Nozick, leveling the playing field just means getting the government out of it. For Rawls, it's very different. Leveling the playing field means that we're going to need some very strong social programs and safety nets. And that's how we're going to give every individual a fair shot and minimize moral luck. It's to give everyone, to raise the lowest up a little bit and to have really strong safety nets for people that fall through the cracks. And that way we can really sort of take into account this problem of moral luck. And Dr. Ballard's going to explain Rawls in more detail for you. So those are what I'm calling the liberal theories. The conservative theories, what makes them conservative is that they focus on the role of communities in shaping the individual. These two theories are republicanism and feminist liberalism. These theories are more conservative, like I said, in that their focus is on the role communities play in shaping behavior and making virtue and justice possible. In a sense, they would agree with Aristotle that a state's purpose is not merely to provide a living, but to make a life that is good. A state must concern itself with virtue. The state's role is in part to make virtuous citizens. For both of these theories, community plays a constraining role on the individual and creates the conditions for the possibility of human flourishing. So the first one is Sandel's republicanism. Michael Sandel these are all Harvard economists and political theorists. Sandel emphasizes civic virtue and individual sacrifice on behalf of society while seeking to preserve political liberty. He engages the moral and religious convictions of individuals and communities that bear in our public life together. Sandel really believes that moral issues necessarily matter for the common good. We've got to talk about these moral issues. And the state has a necessary role in creating a society that is conducive to human flourishing. When the state makes legal and policy decisions, the state cannot avoid the fact that we are making decisions that are going to either increase or decrease human flourishing. And so we have to actually talk about what good societies look like and the kinds of policies that are going to create a good society. And finally, this is who we'll be reading on Thursday, Eucken, who is a student and critic of Rawls, comes up with a theory that I'm calling feminist liberalism. She thinks that many of today's inequalities between men and women reflect gender, the social assignment of different roles, identities, opportunities, duties to persons of different sexes, particularly in the traditional family, with its characteristic division of labor between husband and wife. So here's where, if you have not read the reading from 2 weeks ago, it's completely slipping my mind, from the Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All. If you haven't read that reading, you really should go back and read it, because the first chapter of Eucken's book helps lay the groundwork for her theory. We didn't read it because it's dated. It's 25 years old. But the Atlantic piece will really help you understand what she's kind of talking about. So many of today's inequalities between men and women reflect gender. The idea that gender, at least the assignment of different roles based on gender, is a social construct, right? Why can't women be the primary sort of breadwinners and men be the primary caretakers? There's no reason today why that can't be possible. She thinks that gender and the family have been largely ignored by existing theories of justice, particularly Rawls, but also by Nozick. She's very critical of him as well. She says the family must be just if we are to have a just society, since it is within the family that we learn to be just. So here's where I see her as a kind of a conservative thinker. She really believes and argues that the family matters for the kind of person that you are going to become. And if there are unjust social structures embedded in the family structure itself, we are not going to end up with just adult citizens after they've been raised in unjust social structures at home. So her solution here is we must consistently take the relevant positions of both sexes into account in formulating and selecting and applying principles of justice. And this will make more sense after you read Rawls and Oyken before Thursday's class. But she really looks at the family and says boys and girls that are raised in families where there is a radically unequal division of labor, where there's a radically unequal opportunities for work, where pay is radically different, where many children raised in single parent homes, and overwhelmingly those single parent homes are mothers, and overwhelmingly those mothers make less money. These are all social inequalities that just get perpetuated because families just keep perpetuating them through the raising of children. So she really thinks that we have to radically rethink the family structure itself if we're going to have a just society. So I hope that this sort of overview makes sense. We have these sort of two halves, this more liberal side that's talking about emphasizing individual freedom and autonomy, this more conservative side that talks about the way that communities really matter and that we need to create certain kinds of communities in order for us to have freedom and virtue. These are two different ways, I think, of dealing with this problem of moral luck that we've seen throughout the semester. All right, thanks.